Coming up with the NBA season just 1 month away for the Brooklyn Nets, we take a look at the best version of a rebuild model. The Oklahoma City Thunder, what did they accomplish following the Paul George trade all those years ago? We dive into the draft picks, the successes and failures, and how that path might not be as long as some fans think. We dive in coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. He's Doug Norrie. I'm Adam Marbett. We thank you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day. We are 100% free on all those great platforms, and let you know that now, through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get 3 weeks free of that NFL Sunday ticket we all desire from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started today. And Doug, as we approach a month from now, the beginning of the NBA season, we try to lay out a path for Nets fans to say, hey, starting game one of the 2024-2025 season, you project this 5-year plan for Brooklyn where maybe in year 3, we're talking about a competitive team that has a really bright future with a young core.
Yeah, look, we always knew that resetting around this franchise was going to require some lean years. That was always part of what we signed up
politely,
for.
I like that.
We tried to, explain this in the thought process. And by the way, just before we even get to OKC, I'll say I always understood on some level the fan base that was like, I don't want to do this because I don't want to go through another 70-loss season. You know what I mean? Or something like that, because I lived through that once. And it's not fun to think about doing it again. I will say the difference between this version of it and what happened in the past is that there was no real light at the end of the tunnel for those losses. Those losses didn't actually gain the Nets much, if anything, right? This situation has down chain effects where, like we're going to talk about with OKC, we're going to talk about with some of these other teams that were able to rebuild, quote unquote, relatively quickly. This situation is set up for the Nets to at least put their best foot forward in terms of a reboot and a tank, right? Like, Not all of these things are built the same, and you have to have trust in the front office. That's maybe a discussion for a different day. But like this version of where the Nets are going, there's a world where, like OKC, possibly, it doesn't last as long as people think if things break correctly. And I just wanted to pay, lip service to the group that's a long been. I don't want to sit through 4 years of them absolutely hardcore sucking and then they suck again. And and I get it, but this the deck chairs are lined up okay for this not to be completely like the Titanic here.
You know what's crazy too? Because there are parallels. We're going to use OKC. Obviously, that's where, Kevin Durant was there. James Harden was there. They both ended up being in Brooklyn and a part of this potential opportunity to win a championship. In the last 15 seasons, which goes back to that 12-70 year in 2009, 2010, the Nets have 9 seasons with a losing record. Now, they also have, inside of those 15 years, a total of 8 playoff appearances. So they have been very much a feast or famine franchise. But as we know, when you go and you make those moves and you get in Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving and then James Harden, the expectations of being, 44, 48, 44, 45 win teams and never getting out of that first round beyond the semis in that first year with obviously the toe on the line and all those things. There's just, I think to your point about that segment of the fan base, most teams or most fan bases, even if there are dark days ahead, when you look back, you at least have some recent enough success to kind of hang your hat on. We're 15 years, 15 years and getting about as aggressively teased as you possibly could with having superstar talent at one point along the way and never even getting close enough. If that had gone different, conference finals, NBA finals appearance, even no championship required for the Nets fan base. I just think a few good playoff runs would have satiated them long enough. Instead, it's a failed version of the superstar team, and now go into the 3 to 5 year. Don't worry, we're going to get there. We need to go through this draft process as well.
Yeah, and they're all connected, by the way, too, because if it's like, hey, if they had really positive runs through that, the team probably doesn't break up, right? It's like, we're
here talking about Kevin Durant and James Harden and Kyrie Irving back into their careers as they get older, right?
Yeah, it's like, with the old ex, it's like, well, if it had all gone well, would you have broken up? It's like, well, of course not, but it didn't go well. So that's why we broke up. So like, that's not a really good, it's not a great what if in this scenario, because the breakup happened because of all the stuff that happened. So anyway, when we talk about teams resetting, one thing we heard often was, well, look at Detroit, look at Charlotte, look at these teams that have been mired in mediocrity or worse for years and years and years on the back of these rebuilds. And we'd always say, okay, that's fine, but now just also do the OKCs or like the Denvers and these other teams that, that took it out of a bad team and got superstars, and away you go. And they're actually really good. And I always think it's funny to only use the negative examples when not talking about kind of all the other teams that built the draft and got all the superstars, right? Like basically Boston drafted Tatum, drafted Jaylen Brown, and then kind of go for it by getting Staps later, right? Like these teams, that end up drafting the superstar and then end up being, in championship contention not too long after that. OKC a little different because they didn't necessarily draft SGA, but like you said, there's a parallel here because they do trade away sort of a franchise cornerstone player in Paul George at a time where it maybe doesn't make total sense to do it, because they said, okay, we got one chance at this thing. Yeah. And we're going to go get the haul. Nets kind of do it twice with Kevin Durant and Mikal Bridges to say, we're going to trade away and just get a massive haul. And so I think like that is where this comp starts to line up, with the understanding that the Nets did not get an SGA type level superstar back, with one more caveat that the OKC, I don't think in their wildest dreams that he'd be this good when they first traded for him. The reason I know that is because if anyone thought he was going to be this good, the Clippers wouldn't have attached all along with him, right? So anyone that's going to claim, oh, he's going to be, a top 7 player in the league is not really talking honestly, because even though it was an overpay in terms of draft capital, like no one thought he was going to be this guy. So I'd say I'd throw that out there. Sorry, long-winded, but over.
No, and I think, and this is a big part of any of these discussions, is the unknowns. You don't know what some draft picks are going to turn into. You don't know what SGA is going to become, because if you could, then you'd make all the right choices, keep all the right young players, only bring in expensive superstar veterans when it made sense, avoid all the pitfalls of injuries and otherwise, and then win championships. I mean, that'd be the easiest model if you're an NBA team or any sports franchise. Oh, just do all the right moves and know exactly how they're going to work out. As we get into what became of the Oklahoma City Thunder following Paul George trade, just remind everybody before we get there, they traded Paul George, obviously the Clippers. They got back SGA. They got back Danilo Gallinari, and then 5 first-round draft picks as well, including the rights to swap 2 picks, one of which in 2023 did not convey, and then another one coming in 2026. We're going to get into who those turned into, some of the players that were gotten or not gotten, made or missed, and the guys that ended up becoming a part of the core, some of which were unexpected to be as high contributors as they turned out to be. All of this frames what we think can be the path forward for the Brooklyn Nets, assuming that they get through, along with the fan base, some difficult couple of seasons ahead. We'll continue that discussion on the other side in just one moment.
All right, before we get to that, tell you about our friends over at FanDuel. Look, we talked a ton about FanDuel. It makes sense. They're America's #1 sports book. Got something different for you right now. Now through September 22nd, so you got a little less than a week here. All FanDuel customers can bet $5. You're going to get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. You got the YouTube TV base plan. You're going to be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. You need that Google account. Current form of payment, we got those. Cancel at any time. And I can tell you, this is an absolute lifesaver. I was at a party yesterday, for some reason, a birthday party on the middle of football Sunday. God, negative check marks. But YouTube TV saved me on this one through FanDuel, able to watch the game, able to fully check out on the birthday party, obviously. And we're just rocking with FanDuel, rocking with YouTube TV. Had the NFL Sunday Ticket. It was all there for me in a pinch. Just visit FanDuel.com right now. Download America's #1 sportsbook.
All right, so as we continue today's Locked On Nets episode, talking about the path ahead for the Brooklyn Nets and why the short term may look pretty grim, but it can pretty quickly turn around here for the Nets. Using the OKC model, taking a look at the Paul George trade and how things ended up pivoting somewhat quickly for them. It's only 2 down years before the Oklahoma City Thunder are winning games in the 40s, and then ultimately this past season, as we know, spiking 57 wins and really feeling like they're starting to insert themselves with a young core into that Western Conference discussion as being one of those better teams. One interesting footnote here, though, too, I thought about when looking at this is that they traded Paul George after it was 2018-19, but the following year they still won 40 plus games. It
Well,
took
they had
one more season.
They had Chris Paul in that, and because
right,
and he was like it was actually crazy. It was this Chris Paul, SGA, and Dennis Schroeder. Nets favorite.
Come on,
That's
let's
the
just
3-man
keep
guard.
tying these things together as much as we
It
can.
was like this devastating 3-man guard lineup that like people just like couldn't really figure out, and they would close games with it. And so like they had other pieces. This is where it doesn't make it a perfect comp, but it's okay. It doesn't really matter. Like they had so many picks that it ended up they could afford to just go out there and win some games too, and just be kind of exciting. And CP3 ended up being a good sort of like general and probably just actually making SGA's career, honestly, because he credits him for like teaching him a lot. So anyway, you can keep going.
But no, and on top of that, because you mentioned there in the first segment as well, the big difference is the Nets didn't get back SGA or something equivalent or even close to that in any of these trades that they made. They got back draft picks and they've turned into some players, and we're going to see how they develop, but not this one-to-one where there's been this seismic leap. Although with everything that they've gotten and what they have coming up here in the upcoming draft, you take that step back and say, if Cooper Flag, even getting back their own pick control, which is their own fault for not having, but we'll get to that on another day. If they end up spiking a guy like Cooper Flag, you go, well, that's kind of the equivalent. By making these trades and jettisoning superstars and getting all the draft capital and getting re-control of your destiny, you put yourself in this position to be able to get, hopefully, a generational talent that really moves the needle on what your franchise can be. And the other little footnote here in terms of differences, as you mentioned, when you have guys like Cameron Johnson or Dorian Finney-Smith, you mentioned the veterans here, or Dennis Schroeder, you mentioned these guys and you go, right, they're not going to, in this iteration right now in the upcoming season, spike the Nets up, and you don't want them to anyway. But it's not going to change the outcome of how Cam Thomas and how Noah Clowney and even Nicholas Claxton. That's probably the big difference here. Chris Paul, who feels like we talked about him half a decade ago as maybe being done, and then went on to continue to grip himself onto rosters throughout the NBA for seasons to come. But you needed a guy like that in order to kind of propel one more solid season, something that the Nets aren't looking for right now, but certainly you couldn't expect that unless you had a player that at one point in his career was a premier talent, a guy that drove wins and losses, a guy that can orchestrate an offense. Ironically, the position that the Nets need to identify and fill over the course of their rebuild as well.
Exactly. And, but it also forgets too, and we go back through some of these OKC, again, slightly different path, but not too dissimilar, right? Like they get a good player back in SGA, who at the time is considered very good and makes a leap. Maybe people are like, oh, maybe Cam Thomas gets to somewhere like it does his own leap here, right? These guys that are undervalued to some degree across the league, even by the Clippers, SGA was Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. And then, sort of like, comes on in his third season, basically. Is Cam Thomas eligible for that? We'll see about that. But also being able to use, and this is where the Nets are really in such a good spot, is that let's just remove that first part of the, you get a potential superstar back. Yep. The key with OKC and the key with any of these rebuilds is that you have to have lots of bites at the apple, because some of your draft picks are going to go bad. They're not all going to hit. But that's okay when you have lots of opportunities to draft tons of guys. And that is exactly what OKC has done also. Because, Alexander Pokusevski, Poku, it didn't land. Okay, that's fine. He's gone. No one cares, by the way, right? He's basically out of the league. Josh Giddey, they just traded for basically nothing. They got to get Caruso back. I mean, they get Caruso back for it, but like Giddey's probably considered a draft bust at this point to some degree based on where they drafted him. Fine. You know why? Because they have Chet Holmgren. They have Jalen Williams. They have these, taken lower in the first round. Williams, not Holmgren. They get a high pick. They get a guy in Holmgren who's clearly a hit. They get Jalen Williams, who's really, really good, drafted over, above draft slot at this point, because they had lots of chances at it. That's the key. And that's where the Nets are positioned really well for this, is they have tons and tons of chances for it, that they will have the ability to make a mistake. Hey, they don't land a top pick this year. Great news. Next year's draft is awesome also. Like the AJ Debonsa. Sorry, I always say that wrong. Carlos Boozer. Like these guys or Cameron Boozer, excuse me. These guys are just there waiting too. So like even if it doesn't all work out now, it's okay because they're taking the same model of we just have to have lots of chances at this.
Yeah, you know what? And one of the things you mentioned there, obviously SGA comes over in the trade, but you mentioned Jalen Williams, you mentioned Chet Holmgren. Listen, I'll even put Lou Dort into that mix there as well. He's a drafted player that came in with this organization, and it all goes into it. And the Nets have done this. Jalen Wilson looks like he's going to be an example of a player that comes in and becomes a contributor. In those 4 players, one via trade and the rest of them coming in through the draft picks, that's it, man. Those are the guys that are contributing and playing 28 plus minutes across the board into the 30s, obviously with SGA, 31 for Jalen Williams. These are guys that are giving you the bulk of your scoring on a night in and night out basis. And certainly, you know, even take away the SGA of it, you would still need to get that superstar at some point to really make this thing work, to turn it over, to become a 57-win team. But if I had a core that included Jalen Williams and Chet Holmgren and a player like Lou Dort, who over the course of his career continues to kind of develop and has this defensive specialty about him that you can utilize, and other players along the way too, misses that have come in here. Even Aaron Wiggins has come in and played in 78 games, giving you 15 minutes a night. Their entire roster, from starters, key contributors, high level, and all the way to the bench, is littered with their draft picks. And it's the one thing that I have time and time again said as soon as the Nets started to break this thing up, as hard as it was that once you make a decision like this, and we're not even talking about the fact that you turn around and then take Mikal Bridges and flip him into more future draft capital as well. The Kevin Durant trade, now the Mikal Bridges trade, when you get this much draft capital, it's not easy, but it becomes pretty negotiable to continue to roll yourself over year. They just made the Oklahoma City Thunder another slew of draft picks in this past draft class. Why? Because they keep turning guys over and replenishing their picks. The thing that Brooklyn has never had enough of, that we talk about in the Sean Marks era, good, bad, and different, is draft picks. You mentioned it, bites at the apple. They've never had enough of them. They took a ton of them and wanted to turn them into different players. We get that. But now, this is what should feel different about those past 15 years, the rise and fall. No matter what happens, Cooper Flag, 2 draft classes from now, the Nets in 4 or 5 years should still have more draft picks than most NBA teams, because they should keep turning guys over. They'll end up having maybe instances like OKC. We got too many guys here. Some guys are going to go. Maybe we make strategic decisions to improve our roster from a depth perspective. That, I think, is the most critical piece of this rebuild. It's not just about, though critically, getting one of these players like Cooper Flag, but it's also about, let's not find ourselves here again in 3 or 4 more years, or 5 years or 6 years, right? This 7 to 10 year cycle where the Nets really bottom out and have to figure things out again. I don't know if it matters that they're in Brooklyn and, considered a sub-major market in New York, but I think you want to stop playing those games of taking violent swings and a lot of times having pretty aggressive misses and then a real downfall on the back end of it. I'll find out what Doug thinks about all of that, and also take a look at how OKC's sustained success, tracks going forward now in that Western Conference. We'll do that to close out today's episode in just one moment. All right, as we wrap up today's Locked On Nets episode, talking about the rebuild, looking at Oklahoma City, realizing that when you stockpile enough draft picks, when you have enough opportunities to hit those successes, then you can have a sustained future. Boy, I got to tell you something, Doug. I'm going to pause right here before we even dive any further. Sustained might be my mortal enemy. I should stop using that word. That they can go ahead and continue to have a consistent future for this franchise. And there's a key element to that. I want to get your feedback from the way we closed out that second segment, and having the capital year over year to make sure you don't fall out of the mix at any point along the way.
Yeah, I mean, you made a great point, before when you said Nets have never they've never even had anywhere close to enough picks. Forget where they don't have that many picks. It wasn't even close. Now I get it. Like, at some point you mortgage the future to, well, they double dipped on this because they mortgaged the first future on a complete failure with the KG Paul Pierce mess. And then they do it again, which I think was correct around the James Harden piece, where it's like they mortgage that future. Once they finally get everything back, and then they trade it all the way again to get Harden. I think that was clear because they were in a championship window. And I think you do that every time, even if it was a slight overpay. There's a world where, we run we run the Turn River on that a few times, and it's not always, they get there, right? Like they get there a few more times than just, completely turning to dust. So I think it's fine. But Nets fans, I think, are also like really kind of twisted sideways on this because they just don't really, it's been so long since the Nets have had even adequate draft picks, like league average. They've been out of league average draft picks for a long time. Now they actually have way more than usual. It's such an encouraging spot to be in, and I can understand why there'd be a group of folks out there that simply don't understand it. Like they just aren't like really grasping the sheer number that is coming down the pike here, and that's the key with this thing. Just what you're going to hear us say this 5,000 times this year. The key here is to just have lots and lots of opportunities to do it. They actually almost have more draft picks than they'll be able to even roster at some point. Like this is why it's like, don't even get too attached to the guys on the team this year because they're going to get replaced with some of these draft picks. That's how many guys the Nets have at this point coming in the door in the next 2 years. A few of them being like, just like possibly generational type of guys. And when you have the opportunity, maybe the better comparison would be like the Spurs, right? It's like, they get Wembanyama and all of a sudden it's like, hey, let's go trade for Chris Paul and let's give this a shot, right? Like the Nets could be in that situation quicker than you think. It's not guaranteed, but I would say like that's as likely as it going awful, which is to say they're both like not that unlikely, but they're not that likely. There's a middle part of this curve that's, the fat part of the curve is just somewhere around like sort of what regularly happens in the NBA. But I think anytime you think, oh, it could go terrible, and you look at the Hornets and you look at these teams, just take a look at the Spurs who had some lean years and now got a generational guy. And they're like, let's just try to be good. Let's try to be good. And Chris Paul's like, I'll play there. I'll play there with this guy. And I think like that's as likely as it being Detroit Pistons every year they suck and they're going for all-time losses in year 5 of this. You know what I mean? I see those as proportionally the same in terms of odds.
Yeah, Washington Wizards, where it just seems like they make every wrong choice and give the money to every wrong player at times. Yeah, and for sure. And I think there's probably a whole other episode about the San Antonio model, which is you are kind of living in the dark days. And then to your point, you spike the elite, the generational talent, and now you make different choices. And then there's veteran players who are at a certain point in their career that are not the superstar talent they once were. They're not the guy that every contender is clamoring for, but they are a player that helps a young roster really figure out their path there early on. And at a minimum, gives the fan base, I should say, the optimism of taking that next step forward in the process of not being a team that gets a young player, a guy that everyone's excited about, and then goes and wins, in the 20s in terms of wins and losses for the next 3 years. That becomes a bummer. And then you butt up against that other concern. Well, is the young superstar going to at some point say, I don't want to be here? You should consider about trading me and getting the haul and moving on. I think that's a big proponent of having all these draft picks as well for the Brooklyn Nets is whoever you end up bringing in, whatever your young core looks like, you need to, whether or not fans like this or not, you also then have to keep selling those young generational talent that this is going in the right direction, that we're going to build a winner here, that when you're up for the max contract and we give it to you, you're going to be excited. You're not going to start knocking on the GM's door saying, listen, just so you know, I'm starting to not love it here that much. The Nets do need to put that infrastructure in place from a full roster standpoint over these next couple of seasons as well. And a reminder
along that line, we're probably getting toward the end here, but one thing to even not worry about there is now it can go the wrong way on this, but all these guys just signed their first contract. Like every single one, no one has given up that first big deal yet. As of this recording, September 16th, 2024, no one has given up that first deal to go to free agency prior to their rookie extension. No one that was like an actual real guy. And so now sometimes it ends up being, oh, we got LaMelo Ball at max money here forever. Okay, I hope it works, right? Like sometimes you end up with that, and you're crossing your fingers because the guy's maybe not proven yet, and you have to sort of live with it because he's your guy. Scotty Barnes, Kate Cunningham. We'll see on all these guys that got like the big contracts first before we'd actually seen the full run out. But the flip side of that is all the good guys all the great ones sign those contracts too. So even if it's like not going perfectly in the rebuild and you actually, let's say you get Cooper Flagg and it's not perfect with the team, it's great with him, but it's not with the rest of the team. All these guys sign. No one has gotten all the way to the end of the road yet and said, you know what? No, thanks. They all take the money. Now, so I think it's like that even isn't even the big risk either, because
because you
still
at least
risking
get
its own right, but not for the part where they leave. I think that's the key part to remember.
Yeah, because you get the rookie deal, you get the extension signed, at least a year, maybe 2 years, and then potentially the rumbling start. But by that point, obviously, fingers crossed, we all believe the Brooklyn Nets will be in a different spot. And the one last thing I was going to say as a reminder, because you were mentioning just not having enough bites of the apple or not having enough quality picks. Remember, you have to go back over the last handful of seasons for the Brooklyn Nets. The highest draft pick that they had, I mean, you got to go back to 2010. Again, 15 years. Wouldn't you know it? First round, third overall pick, Derek Favors. That's after that, 17th is the highest first round draft pick that the Brooklyn Nets have had. And that was Alexander Walker, who wasn't even a Brooklyn Net. He ended up Atlanta on his way to the Pelicans. Sadiq Bey at 19. That's a Detroit player. There have not been high draft picks. And I think that everybody knows this. So I don't want to frame it in the way that fans don't understand it. Everybody understands it. When you do, with the higher the draft pick, the higher the pedigree of player. But there's a difference between even when you have success drafting in the 20s than when you have success drafting in the lottery, when you have success getting a top 5 pick, and you cannot navigate that. Even a guy like Cam Thomas, we believe, redo that draft, he goes much higher. But is he going to go top 5? No, probably not. So you can find talent later. You can find the Nicholas Claxtons. You can find even the Noah Clowneys, and they can evolve and turn into really good players. But the opportunity to get these picks is critical and have them go well. And then the last footnote is if you hit well and you get Cooper Flag at the top of the draft, remember, 3 more first-round draft picks. I said it at the top. Roll those over. Turn those into more future first-round draft picks if a team wants to come calling. That's how you keep replenishing and keep putting yourself in a position to take your swings, hopefully more hits than misses, but always know you have more opportunities down the line.
And by the way, remember, the Nets are going to have a top 5 pick nearly guaranteed this season just to start, right? They're going to have that. They're at no, I don't think they're at any risk of not landing in a minimum the top 5. Well, great news. Those guys in the 20s, well, they're going to have 3 of those also just in this draft, in a very deep draft. Like they're going to have at worst they're at worst going to have 3 picks in the 20s with some chance one of these other picks turns poorly, although it's like unlikely, right? But it's still, they'll still have 3 more picks and then 2 more next year and then plus a second rounder. Like they're going to have so many chances.
One of them being from OKC, ironically. So
what's that?
One of those picks is OKC, ironically, in the 20s. So we keep tying these 2 teams together. It's amazing.
All right, we're going to get out of here. Much appreciated. We're back 5 days a week coming here all week long, leading all the way to the season. Nets aren't holding their end of the deal when it comes to winning. They held up to their end of the deal, making sure they just reset the thing. But we're going to hold up our end of the deal 5 days a week from now through the rest of the season. That's through the draft. Come on. No one else is doing that in Nets world. Make sure you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, wherever you listen to and YouTube as well. I'm blowing it here at the end. I'm not holding up my end of the deal. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe over to YouTube as well for Locked On Nets.
Oh, when you arise in the morning, think of what a precious privilege it is to be alive, to breathe, to think, to enjoy, and to love. Why, that is one Marcus Aurelius.
Oh, R.I.P. Rest in peace.
Cut. Yeah, no, he didn't make it.
Well, he'll be missed.
He will.
We'll be back again tomorrow. One of the all-time great poets. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Basketball.